Hello, and welcome to Intermediate WordPress, Content Management and Information Architecture. My name is Brian DeConnick. I work for OIT's Design and Web Services team in the Office of Information Technology. Um, Welcome to a YouTube Live workshop. A couple of notes before we get rolling. Since this is YouTube Live, we are at the mercy of the internet and all the things that can go wrong with the internet. There was one time we did this when YouTube just kind of cut out on us and we had to scramble to bring it back. So if anything happens, just please be patient with us, and I promise we'll try to get things going again as fast as possible. Since this is online and not in person, if you have any questions or if you have any feedback, and at times I'm going to ask you questions and you'll have an opportunity to respond, please do that in the Q&A document, which is linked just below the video in YouTube in the description. So if everybody could please click on that link and then take a moment also to sign in for attendance. Just your name and the unit that you're with would be perfect. We don't keep anything in this document, and it's not visible to the wider internet. It's just NC State. So you don't have to worry about revealing anything super secret to the world or anything like that. And then the last thing I'll say, okay, I guess two more things about YouTube Live. First is that I'm doing this from home, and there's a reasonable chance you'll hear my cats at some point. I choose to think that that's the charm of this production rather than a distraction. But if I get distracted at some point by meowing cats, that's what's going on. But more importantly, since this is being done through YouTube Live, we have a little bit of a delay between when I say something and when you hear it, and then a little bit of a delay between when you type something and I notice it. My colleague Jen McFarland is going to be listening in and hanging out in the discussion document, in the Q&A document, to help me out with that and respond to you as fast as possible. And then she will jump in and interrupt me and share any questions that need to be shared with the group if needed. But again, just bear with us as we do this. Yeah, I guess we can get started. So welcome everybody again to Intermediate WordPress. Let's talk about why we're all here. So why I'm here, or at least why I'm assuming you're here, is that all of you know how to use WordPress. You've done something WordPressy in the past. You know how to make a post or a page, things like that. But you are looking for information and tips on how to use it most effectively. So that's what we're really going to focus on today. It's going to be some WordPress information, some just general good best practices, and hopefully you'll learn a little bit along the way and walk away with some useful things that you can apply right away with the websites that you manage. In general, we're going to be talking about sort of what makes a good website versus a bad website. We're going to talk about accessibility and usability, the Canvas brand guidelines, and then a big focus on how to organize and how best to approach organizing your web content. So with that said, what is your website? And I want you all to respond to this in the Q&A document. And when I say what is your website, I don't mean what's the URL. I don't mean what unit does it represent. I mean, like, what is it for? What purpose does it serve? What, if you were to describe it in 5 words or less, like tangibly speaking, what is your website? So I'm going to mute myself for maybe a minute and give everybody a chance to respond. Okay, cool. So it looks like we have a few responses. Thank you everybody for participating. It makes it a lot more interesting than just me talking, and it also gives me a chance to have some water, which I appreciate. So a few responses, a couple of websites that are personal projects, a couple of websites. You describe sort of what it is that your unit does, or what how the website fits into that. One person says the website describes the services we offer students. These are all great responses, and sort of the reason I'm starting with this is to hopefully get you thinking about um, the role that your website plays besides just being a thing that everybody has to have. And maybe now I'd like to shift gears a little bit and think about, like, at its essence, what is a website? Um, so to do that, here we go. So a website it's how your organization represents itself to the world. It's a gateway to the services that your organization provides. But really the one I want to focus in on is it's a collection of text documents. And that is the least exciting description of a website you can come up with. But I would say when it comes to content management and information architecture, it might be the most useful way of thinking about your website. This really boring, bland, it's a collection of text documents. So to talk about why that is, let's all have a single slide crash course in HTML. If you've used HTML in the past, if you know anything about writing HTML, this should be pretty familiar. If you've never seen HTML before, you don't need any code for this workshop. This is the only time you'll see any of it. This is just sort of helping you understand how things fit together. So your website is coded in HTML, which stands for Hypertext Markup Language. And really all that means is that way back in the early 90s when HTML was first being created, there were text documents. They wanted to have a way of displaying those text documents on the web that was also just being invented. And the solution was to take these plain text documents and add in tags, these little arrowy bracket code snippets here, like header and main and footer, things like that. And those tags would denote sections or particular roles in that text document. So the header tag denotes the sort of the top part of the document, the core information about what the document is. The footer tag is at the end. The main tag describes the main content of the document, things like that. So everything that's contained in those tags has that role. And then the browser, when it encounters those tags, it interprets some of those tags, I guess it interprets them according to rules that can be defined in the browser or in other ways for the website. So we can style them with CSS, we can create interactions using JavaScript, and we can add in media using special tags like the image tag and the video tag and other tags like that. So that is your crash course in HTML, everything you need to know. The key thing is that HTML is a way of structuring a text document. Then comes WordPress. So if you're using WordPress for creating your website, WordPress is a content management system. And the process is you write your text, WordPress saves that text in the database, and then WordPress goes through a process when somebody visits your website of combining the content you wrote, some template files, and all of those standard HTML tags, bring them together into the pages that you see in your browser. So the key takeaway here is that even though WordPress hides sort of the nuts and bolts of the code behind your website, at the end of the day, your website is exactly what it would have been in 1991, just a bunch of text documents. That's all your browser is interpreting. They're pretty nifty text documents that can have playing video and interaction and stuff like that, but it's still just text being displayed on a screen. And the reason I'm spending so much time on this is because that mindset is going to go a long way toward helping to make sure your website is accessible and usable and easy to navigate. So Speaking of things that are not exciting, I'm going to start with a quote from Bill Gates. Content is king. Bill Gates in 1996, he wrote, "If people are to be expected to put up with turning on a computer to read a screen, they must be rewarded with deep and extremely up-to-date information that they can explore at will." It's sort of interesting to think of Bill Gates saying in 1996 that people would have to put up with turning on a computer and reading a screen, since that's sort of what we do all day, every day now. But ultimately, he's right here. The only thing that makes this experience worthwhile is having information that is up to date and that that's easy to get around, easy to navigate and explore. So here's your next question for the Q&A document. What kinds of content are on your website, and how are those different kinds of content different from each other? So again, I'll give people a chance to answer that. All right, so I see a few responses now. We have some things like um, course titles, agendas, promotional text, uh, videos, photos, press releases, um, images, text, linked video and audio. So video and audio that exists somewhere else, I guess. Photos and images. A lot of common things in here. So uh, the reason I'm asking about what kinds of content are on your website is because WordPress has multiple types of content and they're treated in slightly different ways. So first and foremost, your content should be up to date and accurate, easy to read, and well organized. And that goes for any of the excuse me, any of the content types that you have on your website. And the key is that each and every piece of content on your website really should make sense on its own and also in the context of the whole website. But in WordPress, there are multiple content types, and you want to make sure that whatever the content is that you're creating fits into the right type. Um, that I guess you want to make sure that you're using WordPress most effectively by pairing the thing that you're creating with the content type that it should belong with. So I'll just go through these content types very briefly. First and foremost are posts. WordPress was originally imagined as a blogging platform circa 2003, 2004, when blogging was the most exciting thing happening in the world. And so each post is I guess you can think of it as a blog post or maybe a newspaper article or something that, excuse me, sorry. Sorry, excuse me. A little tickle. So posts are like newspaper articles or something that is connected with a certain point in time. You might go back and revise them periodically, but it's not something that you're going back to every day and rewriting, or it's not something that you're going back to and revising every quarter or something like that. Instead, a post is something that you create once. It is relevant for the point in time in which it is created. And then when it's time to talk about something else, you move on and create the next post. And that previous post that you created moves down the page. Um, the News and Observer in Raleigh has lots and lots and lots of back issues, and all of those articles and all of those back issues would be posts that have since sort of moved down the page of their hypothetical WordPress website. I don't actually know if they have WordPress or they use WordPress. Um, Pages, by contrast, are, I guess you'd call them, more durable content. They're content that um, uh, exists, is accurate and up to date. You want to keep it relevant to your visitors, but you're not creating new pages all the time. You're not replacing the pages that you have all the time. Instead, these are pages that serve a purpose and are updated periodically with sort of a new revision. Um, but you're not they're not sort of a day-to-day, every day there's a new one. So here I'm likening them sort of to book chapters. Every now and then there's a new edition of the book that comes out and revises what was in that chapter. Um, but in general, the content of those pages stays relatively static. So, for instance, if you have a departmental website, your pages might be something like about our team, or the services that you offer, or something like that. And the posts would be something like, here's the latest news from our team, or here are events that are coming up, something like that. We then have media library in WordPress. So several people mentioned video and photos. Um, the media library is going to contain the post type that WordPress calls it is attachment, although you may not see that very often. In the user interface, you'll mainly just interact with them through the media library. And those will be images. Those will be downloadable files like PDFs or Word documents if you need to distribute files, or in principle, lots of other things. The software licensing website for campus uses the media library for managing licenses that you need to download in order to use certain pieces of software on campus. So it can really be any file that is sort of a standalone file that isn't a web page that you would view. Um, there are, in theory, it's also possible to have video in your media library. On campus, we generally recommend people don't do that because of, basically because you have YouTube and Vimeo and other services that are really more optimized for serving video. But your media library is a good way of maintaining other kinds of sort of rich media content. Then you have custom post types, which are sort of any kind of content type that you might want that doesn't fit into those other areas. So that might be, for instance, people directory, all of the faculty in your department. Um, and in that case, you have a certain structure that you're following for all of those people. Each person gets a profile, and each profile contains the same pieces of information, like a their name, their title, their office number, their phone number, their email address, things like that. Excuse me. So custom post types are a very useful tool for creating a collection of content that doesn't fit into the other post types because it has a particular structure that it needs to follow, or it needs to be grouped together in some way. And then finally, we have these content types that aren't really content types. They're just sort of, you might call it metadata, or information about your website. And that's everything that lives, excuse me, that's everything that lives in your site header or your site footer, or sometimes in your sidebars. Um, so that's information like the name of the website that you're on, your navigation menu, basic information that might be in a footer, like contact information, things like that. So at this point, I want to point out a couple of useful plugins that are available for campus. Excuse me, one moment, please. All right, I'm back. I am recovering from a cold. I thought I was probably at about 95% this morning. I may drop that down to about 85%, but let's keep going. So these plugins are available for campus for use in departmental and other unit websites. There are a couple of people, it sounds like, who are watching this presentation because they're working on personal websites. They may not have access to these specific plugins, but there are definitely other plugins like them out there in the WordPress ecosystem that, excuse me, that will probably be useful for you as well. So the first one is from the engineering IT group iTex, the Google Drive integration, which extends the media library by pulling in content from Google Drive. University Communications has created the NC State Directory plugin, which is what I was thinking about with my example just a minute ago, that sort of structured information for people profiles. Then Gravity Forms is a premium plugin that's available for purchase out there in the world of WordPress plugins. And we have a few licenses for that available on campus for some campus sites. And Gravity Forms is a custom post type, excuse me, that's used for managing form submissions. Sorry about all the coughing. I know that's not fun to listen to, but I promise I'm really feeling okay. Jen, my colleague who's listening in, is probably rolling her eyes because she's been telling me that I need to take time off, but she doesn't know what she's talking about. All right, let's keep going. So this class, this workshop is titled Content Management and Information Architecture. So, so at this point, let's define what information architecture is. Usability.gov defines it as organizing, structuring, and labeling content in an effective and sustainable way. And the key here is this idea that your content needs to be managed in a way that is useful to your users and is sustainable by you. They have this image included at usability.gov of these overlapping circles, this Venn diagram sort of thing of your users, your context, and your content. And here's what they mean by that. For your users, you want to be thinking about the people who are coming to your website. And you want to be thinking about what their expectations are, what they're trying to accomplish, and what they know how to do. And we're going to be talking a lot about that a little bit later. For the context, that's why does this website exist? Who owns this website? And again, what are people who are coming to the website trying to accomplish? For the content, it's this question of how much content do you have? What kind is it? So that might be a file type, that might be a purpose, what role it plays in your business process. And then who owns and maintains this content? Sorry. So all three of these play in together to sort of determine your information ecology. All of these questions have answers that are related to each other. You can't really answer one of these questions without starting to answer one of the other questions. They all commingle. And these are the sorts of questions that you want to start thinking about and asking yourself and answering in the context of your website. In particular, that last question, who owns and maintains this content in a large organization, NC State, or large organization like a nonprofit or something like that, these questions of who maintains it after it's been created can be really challenging. We have a tendency to create something and then walk away from it and just hope that it'll always be relevant on the web. But over time, things change. And if you're putting out bad information, that might be worse than putting out no information at all. At this point, I really want to plug another plugin. This was developed by some people at Texas A&M, a woman named Stephanie Leary in particular. This plugin called Content Audit. That helps us with the maintaining of content over time. I would say it's overkill if you have a small website, but if, for instance, you have a website like oit.ncsu.edu that has 700 or 800 pages of content, then maintaining it and making sure that the right people are looking at each page, that becomes a much bigger project. So what Content Audit does is it'll allow you to designate content owners on a page-by-page basis, the person who is responsible for this content. It will let you set a content expiration date on a page-by-page basis. So after March 1st, 2019, somebody needs to take a look at this. And then it will give you ways of marking content that needs revision. So if you know that this is outdated, but you don't know how to update it, you want to flag it for somebody else, then there are ways of flagging it and bringing it to the attention of somebody else. So we've talked very briefly about the types of content that are available in WordPress, but then there's all this extra information that WordPress allows us to create that involves organizing our content. And the key things that are available here are taxonomies, which will be things like categories and tags, and then you can also create custom taxonomies. So for instance, with that directory plugin again, there's a custom taxonomy called group. So you can, for instance, group together people with similar research interests. um, you have page hierarchies, which we'll talk about in just a moment, navigation menus, and then wayfinding elements. So that gets back to the header and footer, um, things that might be in your sidebar, the search tool that appears on your website, and so on. So I mentioned hierarchy and navigation, and these are two things that sometimes can get confused, but they really serve two different purposes. They are best friends, they get along together great, but they're not the same thing. And the key is that hierarchy is for you, the person who manages the website, and navigation is for them, the people who are visiting your website. So navigation is the structure and availability of menus. If you land on a website and you have the navigation menu across the top of the page, that's what we're talking about. Hierarchy is how the content in your website is organized inside of WordPress. So some of that is going to be what content type you're selecting. You're putting it into posts, you're putting it into pages, but then also within those content types, how the content is organized from there. So here we have hierarchy. This is from inside of WordPress, a list of pages that are available, or rather pages that have been created in the OIT Design and Web Services website. And in this screenshot, we are opening up a drop-down that has all of our pages listed, and you see each page has some alignment in that drop-down. If it's all the way to the left, that means it is sort of a top-level page. If it's indented one level, then it means that it is the child page of the page that's above it. And then if it's indented further, then it's a grandchild. It's in this tree or this outline, showing this relationship between the pages. That relationship is really important. It can change the URL structure for each page, but also just inside of WordPress, it helps you find stuff. It groups things together in a really natural way so that you know that if you're in the documentation section, then you can find the documentation for the Hillsborough theme or for the NC-State shortcodes plugin or so on. In another part of WordPress, if you go to Appearance and then Menus, now you can create navigation menus. And this is the part that is outward facing. This is what your users are seeing. And these navigation menus, so off to the left-hand side, you have your available pages and other content types that you can select individually or in mass, and then click the Add to Menu button. And those will add these little boxes, each of which represents one of those pages or posts or something else. Each of these boxes can then be dragged and dropped and into the order that you would like them to appear in, but you can also sort of tug them to the side, and that will indent them and create a similar sort of relationship that you see in the list of all pages, where that indentation represents that indentation represents being a child of the thing that's above it. But in this case, that child relationship in your front-facing, user-facing navigation menu doesn't have to have anything to do with how things are organized in WordPress for you. You can have items more than once in a navigation menu. You can have them be children of things that they're totally unrelated to in the hierarchy of the website. It just has to do with how you want to group your content together as it's presented in the navigation to your users. How it's presented to your users may not always have anything to do with how your content is maintained in your organization. It may not have anything to do with who's responsible for that content. Instead, these are questions of if I'm a user who doesn't know how things work, how am I going to find the thing that I need to find? So, talking about hierarchy, a few things that you will probably want to think about. First is to make sure that you use descriptive page titles. That will help you find your content in WordPress when you're going through and revising or editing. And then in general, try not to duplicate page names. So you might have an about page and you might about your team, and you might have an about page that's about the services that you offer. If you name them both about, that's going to get confusing for you. Even if you have a good hierarchy, a good set of relationships where it's clear what section you're in, excuse me, it's just not a good practice. It's going to confuse you somewhere along the way. Each page in WordPress can only have one parent, so you really want to make sure that that's the right parent that it goes with, and that's okay. That parent really, again, has to do with how you're organizing it for yourself and how you are thinking about, or how your organization is thinking about that content. When it comes time to create navigation menus, you can give your content multiple parents by putting it in multiple places. Sort of a page can be underneath multiple other pages. But when you're creating your hierarchy, you really want to focus in on how does this make sense to my organization? Where should I put it? And then when you're creating posts, you want to take advantage of the taxonomies that are available in WordPress, your categories and tags in particular, and then any other custom taxonomies that might be created. Those taxonomies are going to be useful for filtering, especially once you have many posts to organize. And those taxonomies will be useful for Google and other search engines for indexing your content and making it findable to people who are coming in via search. One thing to be aware of is that when you change a page parent, so when you're moving it somewhere in the hierarchy, that can change that page's URL. And so you'll want to go back through anywhere where that page is linked and double check and make sure that those links are correct, or see if they need to be updated. Navigation, again, is the user-facing, public-facing side of things. The theme that you use in WordPress may have multiple menu areas, and then if you have sidebar areas or widget areas, you can add more menus there. If that seems like something that makes sense to do using the custom menu widget. Some menu areas or navigation areas may have a vertical or a horizontal orientation. Oftentimes, if it's horizontally oriented, so for instance, the main navigation across the top of a website going across the banner header, the child relationship where you have a page that's a child of another page in the navigation menu, oftentimes that manifests itself as a drop-down where you hover over that item and the drop-down opens up. And so that's the next point here, the availability of drop-down menus. Not all themes treat them the same way. Not all themes have support for multiple levels of drop-downs, the sort of cascading menu after menu after menu. And some themes don't always handle moving through those drop-downs very well. And then finally, as you build out your navigation menu, you want to be thinking about what is this like on a mobile device? How does this collapse down? A lot of those decisions are design decisions made in the theme, but you want to be aware of what those decisions are, as that will inform how you build your menu and what you prioritize. Some best practices when you're working on your navigation menus. You can shorten and rename page titles in the menu interface in WordPress. So if your page title is about our services, but in the context of the menu, it makes sense to just call it about. that's something that you can do that won't break anything. Just before you shorten it too much, make sure it makes sense to the people who are going to be using that menu. And that comes to the next bullet point: use specific but readable navigation titles and terms. You don't want to oversimplify it to the point where it's just not usable. In general, try to limit menus to 5 to 8 items. We'll talk a little bit about that when we get into the usability section, but that's basically about as much as people will be able to remember as they're reading through the menu items before they start to forget what they saw earlier on. And then make sure that your menu grammar and audience is consistent. So if you're I guess don't change your tense. Don't change about us versus talking about them or something like that. Um, and then this last bullet point: think before you drop down. We sort of got it into that in the previous slide. Not all themes treat drop down menus the same way, but also don't try to make your navigation menu too complex. Think about what problem the drop-down menu is solving, and think about if there's another way that you could solve it rather than making the menu more complex. So, for instance, a landing page where you click on a link and it has sort of a selection of options that you can then click through to, rather than just having somebody have to navigate through multiple levels of drop-downs. And then finally, when it comes to navigation in particular, but hierarchy as well, don't be afraid to experiment. With your navigation menus, WordPress will let you create as many as you want. So you can create all of these menus and switch them out periodically and see which one works for you. In particular, you can ask others to try them out. You can do some informal usability testing. And in some cases, you might even want to change them seasonally. So with that, I'm thinking about, we are an institution of higher learning. We have a new set of students every fall, and sometimes that might change what shows up in your navigation menu. It might make sense to reorder things or promote certain things one time of the year, and then switch that out to a different version of the menu later in the year. So this is all sort of big picture designing your website or structuring the content in your website, but at some point you actually need to create pages, and you want those pages to be useful and usable as well. So here's the next question I want to prompt you for the Q&A document. How do you design a new page for your website? What are the steps that go through your mind as you are going through that creative process? So again, I'm going to mute myself for a minute, get a little bit of water, and then we'll talk about those responses. Okay, I'm back. I have water, I have a cough drop. I'm ready for action. So, how do you design a new page for your website? What are the steps in your creative process? We have a couple of responses. Find a layout that matches the content I'll be delivering, has the structure that I need. If there isn't a post type that matches, start with the current page and copy it. Revise content, add new photos, change design as needed. So these are good starting points. I'm going to um, tell you about sort of the ideal way to do it, at least as far as I'm concerned from where I come from. So, the first thing is to not do, um, excuse me, the first thing is to not do the things that you might be tempted to do, which are things like sketch the page, start out by thinking about your images, your video, or other artwork that show up on the page. And in some cases, don't even look at other people's websites for similar pages. Instead, try starting with these 3 steps. First, ask yourself who's going to be visiting this page and define for each page the audiences and maybe even sub-audiences. So for instance, on campus, is this a page that is geared toward students versus faculty and staff? Is this a page that's geared toward people who are already enrolled in the program versus people who are thinking about the program? Things like that. Second, ask yourself, what are they trying to accomplish by arriving on this page? Is it purely informational? Like, are they just curious about what is this whole thing about? Or are they looking to start some sort of a process, like an application process or a, um, a request process or something like that? Even if there's not a form involved, maybe your page includes instructions on where to go to do something or to receive some kind of assistance. Excuse me. So ask yourself, what are people trying to accomplish? And people are trying to accomplish more than one thing on that page. Prioritize what those most frequent needs might be. And then finally, once you have answers to those questions, make an outline. It's going to be just like middle school English class. You're going to start at the top with a title. You're going to give yourself your big sections and indent each time with each subsection that you might want on the page. That you might be noticing some similar themes here to these information ecology questions for your users, your context, and your content. And this is all the same thing that you had earlier on with your whole website, focused in on this sort of mini situation of just this one page in your website. The other thing I'm going to challenge you all to think about is what happens when somebody is on a page and they aren't calm and rational and thinking about, oh, well, I'm looking for this and this and this, and here are my objectives. Sometimes people use our websites when they are not happy. Sometimes they use our websites when they're not rational. So an example might be, since we are the Office of Information Technology, our group, uh, people come to us when they can't log in. I can't get into my email. If I'm a student, maybe I need to email a professor a copy of my paper, and I can't log in. I'm kind of freaking out now. I don't want to fail this class. All of a sudden, everything starts cascading. All of a sudden, you're in a full-on panic attack. Like, what if I have to drop out because I can't get into my email? Um, these are the things that people are thinking about as they're using our websites, and they're things that sometimes we forget about as we are creating the pages and the posts that they're reading. So one thing I'm going to challenge you to do is think about, are there stressful situations that might lead somebody to arriving on this page? And with those stressful situations in mind, does that change how you want to structure your content? Does that make the things that are relevant to those possible crises more important and move them up the page to be more prominent and visible? The sort of, if you're here because you can't log in, do this first. If you're here just because you're looking for information about our login process, then that's further down the page. And then finally, when you're thinking about how you're structuring your content, this is, I think, a really good tip, and I encourage everybody to find somebody who can fill this role. Find a designated dissenter. um, your designated dissenter could be somebody you work with. It could be somebody that you don't work directly with, but you'd like to bring in for an outside opinion. It could be a family member, just somebody who that will take on the job for you of hearing your idea, coming up with a reason why your idea won't work, telling you that it won't work, hopefully not in a mean way, but bluntly telling you, I don't think that's going to work. And then talking through why that is and helping you come up with a better idea. And the key is to talk to your designated dissenter throughout the process of creating a new page or creating multiple pages together, not just at the end of your process. Your designated dissenter should be somebody who can help you refine your ideas, can help you come up with potential challenges before they become a problem for your users. Once you've hammered through what the structure of your page should be, you're really confident after talking with your designated dissenter that this is the way it should work, that's when you should start thinking about making it pretty. So that's where you start looking at templates. That's where you start looking at other people's examples, things that they've done elsewhere. My tips here are first to follow established patterns. In other words, don't be afraid to steal ideas from other people and other websites. Make sure you use a white space for separation. People are comfortable scrolling. There once was a time in the world of the web where scrolling was difficult, where you had to push that key on your keyboard over and over and over again to move down the page. And so there was this tendency to try to scrunch things together as close as possible above the fold. It's still important to put sort of key important information in a prominent and visible place, but in general, people are pretty forgiving about needing to scroll down because as technology has improved, scrolling is easy. You have your track wheel on your mouse. You have on a touch screen an easy swipe gesture. Scrolling is not a difficult thing, and people are willing to scroll if it's meaningful and clear that they're getting to something that's useful. And so white space is not a bad thing. White space is a nice, clean separation between different sections of content. And then finally, don't overthink it. Those headings that you created when you were outlining things, keep those headings. You can use those headings for structuring your page. Make sure you use consistent font sizes. Don't go big and small over and over again to try to highlight important things. It's okay to make it clear and readable and make important things bold rather than try to overthink the font sizes. And then don't go overboard with images and video. You can make it a very pretty and tasteful page with a couple of images, maybe one image per section or something like that. And that can be very visually engaging without everything having to be this sort of multimedia adventure. If you are creating a university website, departmental or unit website, something like that, at this point you need to start thinking about the university brand. And if you have not read the brand guidelines at brand.ncsu.edu, I would encourage you to do that at some point. The brand serves multiple roles on campus. First, it differentiates us from peer institutions. You don't want people to accidentally think that they're on a UNC webpage. You get a lot of that just from color scheme, but also just how we talk about ourselves, how we present ourselves to the world as a university comes from our approach with the brand. The brand also gives us a universal voice and tone. So university communications, when you talk to them, they're all about the sort of active voice rather than a passive voice, making sure that you are bold and innovative and things like that. If you're not exactly sure how bold and innovative translate into the copy that you're writing on your website, go to brand.ncc.edu. They have some examples. But then ultimately, the biggest thing that the brand does is it builds trust with users. By having this consistent presentation of this is what an NC State website looks like across every website on campus, then the users that are arriving on our websites, they trust that this is an authoritative source of information. This is useful information that's coming from professionals who know what they're talking about. And then also, in some cases, they trust that this is real information and not some sort of phishing scam that's trying to trick them into submitting their username and password so that somebody can take control of their account. So the brand is really important for campus websites. If you're working on a personal project, this is somewhat less important, but it's probably a good idea for you to establish for yourself at least habits or conventions that you're going to follow for the web content that you create. For creating things for campus and making them look nice, this is where some other campus plugins come in. Our team has created 2 plugins, NC State Shortcodes, which is only for the classic editor, so the WordPress editor that if you've been using WordPress for a few years, you're probably very familiar with. Creates common page elements and matches the university brand. You may know this already, but WordPress has introduced a new editor. You might hear it called Gutenberg or just the block editor. As that editor rolls out, our team has also created a new plugin called NC State Blocks, which serves the same purpose. We've created page elements that you can add to your pages and posts that, again, match the university brand and give you ways of making your page very engaging and visually distinctive. And so just a few screenshots from that plugin, just so you have a taste of what might be available. We have our sort of big banner callouts with an image, and it's clickable. We can have an icon. Lots of things you can do with headings and icons to sort of set up separate sections and and indicate using an icon sort of what that section is about. We have what we call major links, which are these hyperlinks that you can click that when you hover over them, they have the little arrow that scoots over to the right. You can have icons that are purely decorative for sort of providing a thematic, this is what this page is about. And then all of the blocks that we built come in the upper right-hand corner of the screen here. We have an example of sort of the documentation that comes with the block. A little bit of text describing what it's about, a little bit more text giving a little additional description, and then a link to a knowledge article that explores in depth sort of how this block is supposed to work. So if you have not seen the new Gutenberg editor prior to this, it's something that you should get excited about. We're not rolling it out for very many websites on campus because there are still some bugs that are still being worked out, but I think there's a lot to be excited about, and hopefully you'll be seeing these blocks more and more in the next several months. That's what I'll say about that. Some page layout best practices. We hinted at some of these earlier. Be sure to break your text into smaller chunks with helpful headings. And when you're using those headings, use the heading levels correctly. So we'll talk a little bit more about this when we talk about accessibility, but this gets to the outline that you created earlier when you were creating your page. Your title is going to be your H1. Each section from there is going to be an H2, and the subsections within there will be H3s, and so on for H4, H5, H6. Where appropriate, you can use lists and tables. Lists especially give like these bulleted lists, or in the NC State brand, they are often displayed with a little red chevron. Lists are a very good way of breaking up content and making it easy to find and scan it and quickly identify the information you're looking for. It's much better to use those bulleted lists than it is to just have a block of text with semicolons. In general, just as a rule of thumb, if you have an image that's purely decorative, float that image to the right so that it's sort of something you can skip over and ignore. If it's something that is content related, it's communicating useful information, float that image to the left. That way, it interrupts the flow of the text that you're reading in a way that's going to draw attention to it. That's not a hard and fast rule, but those are good things to do, good best practices. And then when possible, avoid excessively wide areas of text. That's something that you may have to choose a page template in your theme, depending on the theme that you're using, to make sure that you don't have uh, excessively wide sort of lines of text. And then I guess maybe the key thing here is just don't do things like this. Giant walls of text are no fun for anybody. It's overwhelming. Nobody's going to read all of this. And in some cases, it may discourage your users from continuing through the website because they feel like they're never going to find the thing that they're looking for. So don't create text walls. Don't use all capital letters. Um, it is a lot of the time interpreted as screaming or shouting at your users, and we try not to do that. Usually, well, sometimes you really want to, but don't use abnormally small fonts or small line heights. Most themes that you use will probably have good defaults for that. So don't go out of your way to make the font too much smaller or the line heights too much smaller. In general, don't justify or center align content text. Occasional things sort of centered to draw attention to them, short snippets of text might be a useful way of drawing attention, but try to stick with what people are used to, which is uh, a flat left-hand side for your text paragraphs, and then sort of the jagged edge on the right-hand side. It's a very natural way of reading. Usability studies find that it's the easiest way to read that content. And then again, white space is your friend. When you have natural white space between paragraphs, stick with that. Don't go out of your way to add tons and tons of extra space, but don't go out of your way to remove white space either. In general, dark fonts and light colors are easier to read for text that's appearing on your screen. In some cases, if it's not easier to read for some people, there are ways of inverting those colors. But as a starting point, especially at NC State, where we have our red and our white, that black text on a white background is going to be a lot easier to read than anything against the red background. And then sans serif text, so those fonts that don't have the little serifs or the little like extra tails on the letters, things like that. Sans serif text is generally easier to read on screens. So again, a lot of themes are going to do that out of the box. Don't go out of your way to try to change that. So we've talked about uh, how we're organizing our content. We've talked about how we're building pages. Now let's talk about something that's really important to me and really important to the university, which is accessibility. So again, I'm going to give you a prompt to think about for the Q&A document. Imagine a building entrance with stairs but no ramp. Who's going to have trouble getting into the building? And try to think of as many different types of people as possible who are going to have trouble getting into the building. Okay, so I'm seeing a few responses in the Q&A document, and you guys are fantastic. You are getting exactly what I'm hoping you'd get. So some examples: moms with strollers, people who use wheelchairs, somebody who has a visual impairment, anybody with limited mobility, crutches, maybe somebody that uses a walker, for instance, things like that. I would also add into that anybody who's carrying a large box. If you've ever moved into an apartment on the second or third floor with no elevator and you're trying to carry things up the stairs, you can't see your feet and your center of gravity is thrown off. You probably kind of wish there was a ramp. So lots of people benefit from um, the things that we do for accessibility in the physical world. And that's also true for the things that we do for accessibility in the digital world too. Microsoft's design group defines disability as mismatched human interactions, which I think is a really good mindset to have when you go into building something for the web. It's not about something that's wrong with somebody. It's about this interaction that's not built for all people or built for, or this interaction that's not designed for as inclusive a group of people as it could be. Microsoft also uh, created this really nice graphic that highlights the idea that disabilities can be permanent, temporary, or situational. So just going across the very top line for touch visibility or disability, somebody that only has one arm has a permanent disability. Somebody who has an arm injury has a temporary disability, and somebody who's holding a baby or really holding anything, but like a new parent, for instance, has a situational disability. They're not able to uh, extend the full range of motion they would normally have in that situation. And so the things that we do for accessibility in the physical world and the digital world, they benefit everybody. And so here's my question for all of you. What's the best thing you can do to make sure everyone can use your website? I'm going to give Jen just a second to type that up and then give people maybe 15 seconds to come up with a quick response. There's absolutely a right answer to this one. Okay, I'm not seeing anybody brave enough to try. So I will tell you what, at least for me, what my right answer is. The best thing you can do to make sure everyone can use your website is to remember that your website is just a bunch of text documents. So assistive technology, so screen reading software and things like that, assistive technology is good at interpreting text. It's not so good at interpreting information that's embedded in an image or something like that. And so focusing on making sure that you have good text, that all of the information that you have is available as text, and that is readable and structured in a way that's easy to navigate benefits everybody. Easy to navigate in this case might mean something like making sure that you can navigate it in just by keyboard in a way that makes sense. Every time you hit tab and you skip from one link to another link to another link, making sure that something hasn't changed in the order of those links that is confusing or disorienting. Like you lose your focus and then you have to go back up to the top of the page or something like that. So remembering that your website is just a bunch of text documents is a is a good starting point for having a good and accessible website. And so here's some examples of that. In WordPress, when you're adding a new media file like an image, um, off to the right-hand side, you have this panel that has information about the image that you've uploaded. WordPress will give you out of the box the file name, the file type, information about when it was uploaded, maybe the dimensions of the image, things like that. And then there are these additional fields. You have a title for your image. And in general, that title is something that really only shows up in your really only shows up in your administrative interface in the media library. Then you have space for the caption for the image, and that's going to be text that appears on screen right beneath the image, so that anybody can see the information about that image that you want to communicate in the caption. That caption is also available to assistive technology. It benefits everybody. Below the caption, you have another field for your alt text or your alternative text, and this is intended to be a textual representation of the image that's going to be displayed on the page. That textual representation, what you really want to do is focus on the key sort of essential information that's communicated by the image. So if you have an image that is just purely decorative, its only purpose is to make your page look pretty, you should leave your alt text field blank. It is totally okay to have blank alt text. Your users who are using assistive technology will never have it announced to them. It's like it was never even there. It's just purely decorative and something that everybody can ignore. If it's supposed to communicate information, so for instance, this screenshot here is a screenshot from Google Drive. It was used in one of our training pages, and the information that's being communicated here is just that it's an image of what Google Drive looks like. But perhaps you might have a situation where the key information that's being communicated with this image is that there's the sharing icon and the notification icon that appears in Google Drive next to the file name. So the alt text in that case should be describing that notification icon and where it is in relation to the file name. Your alt text should be about 140 characters, sort of an old style tweet, and it should be sort of presented in a very simple and straightforward, matter-of-fact way. Just the information that should be interpreted from the image. As a bonus, if somebody who is using your website on a slow internet connection isn't able to load all of the images on the page, most browsers will display the alt text in place of the image. So again, accessibility benefits everybody, or in this case, accessibility also benefits people who might be on their phone out in the middle of nowhere where they don't have a great cell signal, something like that. And then finally, you have this field that's labeled description. The description field is used in a couple of different places. Inside of WordPress, it will be displayed in some views to help you understand like which image is which in your media library. For the public side of your website, the description is often included as the long description attribute that's available to screen readers and other assistive technology. You have more space in the long description to give a lengthy description of what's going on in the image. So if for instance, it's a complicated pie chart or something like that, you can give a longer description of what's going on, and that can be available to assistive technology users. However, I would also say that if it's complicated enough that you have to give a long description to describe it, you might want to just include that description in the regular text of the page as well, because if that kind of description is going to benefit people who are using assistive technology to interpret the image, it might benefit people who don't need to use assistive technology, but might just be confused about what's happening in the image. It's never a bad idea to include multiple ways of describing something to help people understand it with sort of different perspectives and how they're going to learn. So some image tips. Make sure you use your alt text to describe relevant information, and don't use alt text for decorative images. Use captions when needed. In WordPress, so WordPress does have image editing features built in, but resize and edit before you upload rather than after you upload. That will take up less space on the server, and really just WordPress isn't Photoshop. If you need Photoshop, you should use Photoshop rather than using WordPress's sort of cheap imitation of Photoshop. Whenever possible, link to a larger version of the image. So if you've resized it to be something sort of web friendly, you can still link to a larger version or the original version of it. And then again, videos are often better hosted outside of WordPress. Tools like YouTube or Vimeo are optimized for video hosting. WordPress is good at a lot of things, but it's not YouTube. The next thing to talk about for accessibility are headings. So remember that outline that you made earlier? That's going to be extremely relevant when you are structuring your page for accessibility. So again, your title is going to be in H1. In most themes, you don't need to actually use your H1 headings in your post content. That's just going to be the title that you put into your title field at the top. So then you go straight to H2 for your major section headings, your topics. Choosing your right heading level can be a little tricky sometimes for a page that's maybe complex or that doesn't have a lot of text, that's more of a landing page, something like that. So the best thing you can do is, again, make an outline. Go straight back to 8th grade English and go through that same exercise where you work through sort of how your document should be structured, and then identify the headings from there. So in the classic editor, we have a screenshot here of this drop down to choose your heading size. If you don't see this in the editor, there's a little button at the end that if you click in your menu of options just above the content area of the editor, you have all of your buttons. At the very end on the right hand side, there's a button to push that opens up a second row of buttons, and the paragraph and heading drop down is in that second row. If you are using the new block editor, that's going to look something more like this, where you select the heading block, and then you have the heading levels available to you in context right above the text that you're writing. If you have data tables, that's great. Tables are a fantastic way of exposing information to your users. The key thing is that you want to use it for tabular information only. And tabular information for tables, that really, think of that as you only want to use it for information that can be grouped into clear, like column headings or row headings. So here we have a screenshot of an example. IT contacts on campus. In the leftmost column, we have our list of units on campus. In the middle column, we have their email addresses. And in the right column, we have their phone numbers. So this is highly structured content, and each column is labeled with the kind of information that's available in that column. If you use HTML, if you know HTML, you can use the TH tags for table heading, and then scope of column or row for identifying what the scope of that heading is, whether it's describing a column or a row. If you are terrified of the code, if you don't want to touch anything like that, then you can use a plugin for managing it. TablePress is a really popular plugin, and it has tools for adding column and row headings. It's not too hard to find those tools and tinker around. And if you need any help, you can reach out to us. We have lots of experience with TablePress. The key thing here is to never use tables for layout. Tables are for tabular information only. A few more things to think about when you're thinking about accessibility for your web content. Make sure your form fields have proper labels. If you do have videos, make sure you have closed captioning or even a transcript on the page. If you've uploaded a video to YouTube, for instance, or Vimeo, those services support closed captioning, and in YouTube's case, at least, they will have a algorithm run that will listen to the video and try to create closed captions automatically. The result is spotty at best, but you can override that with your own captions or edit what they give you as well in your video manager. Make sure that the contrast between the text and the background is sufficient that you can read it easily. There's an algorithm for this that spits out a number, but honestly, you'll be able to know it when you see it. If it's easy to read, then it's easy to read. If it's hard to read, then you shouldn't do it. If it's sort of borderline, you still probably shouldn't do it. Make sure that you keep your writing simple and clear. This is another area where accessibility benefits everybody. If it's easy to understand, then it's easy to understand for everyone. And avoid click here links. We really like, for some reason, we really like to have links that say click here to do whatever. But you want to make sure that your link text makes sense out of context. So a lot of assistive technology will provide, so for instance, the screen reading software will provide its user with a list of all of the links on the page, and you can jump to the link that you're interested in. And if it's all just a bunch of links that say click here, click here, click here, click here, click here, there's no real information about what's going on. But if you instead you rephrase it to um, instead of click here as your link to learn about our services, you could just have a link that says learn about our services. And you don't need that click here text. It simplifies the writing, and it also makes the link easier to understand in isolation. So this has been a super fast crash course in accessibility. If you want to learn more, accessibility.oit.nccu.edu is the place to go. The university has an IT accessibility coordinator who can help out with assessing your website. And then there's some tools available to you, including a WordPress plugin that's an accessibility helper. Lots and lots that can be talked about for accessibility, but hopefully this is a good starting point. And then comes usability. Usability is distinct from accessibility, but it's still really important to think about. And so I think this might be my last prompt for everybody. What makes something usable? So in the physical world or the digital world, what makes something easy to use? So if you'd like to take a moment to answer that question in the Q&A document. So far it looks like only one response, clear instructions. I think maybe I lost a few of you. That's totally okay. So clear instructions is a really good answer. I'm going to go a step further than you and say what makes something usable is when you don't need to be told how to use it at all. And so that's that's really the thing that you want to start with, is build on what your users already know. And your users know a lot already. They have been using websites. They did not boot up their very first computer, open up the web browser, and visit your website first before they did anything else. They have this whole lived experience of knowing how things are supposed to work. And so don't make people learn something new, and don't fight the things that people already know. And if you do need to make people learn something new, then you make sure that it's in manageable bite-sized steps with clear instructions. And so let's go through a couple of examples of what I mean by building on what your users know. First is this idea of natural mapping. So for the purposes of this, we're defining natural mapping as natural arrangements between controls and their action in the world. They should reduce uncertainty when completing a task. I have lived in some really crummy apartments, and in some of those apartments, the stove, the knobs on the stove have been aligned in a row, as in the image on top, and the text that was painted on the knobs that said which burner the knob goes to, which burner the knob controls, has been completely worn away. In which case, when I move into that apartment, I need to play this little guessing game to learn which knob goes with which burner. Wouldn't it be so much easier if we had the second image here, this natural mapping, the 2x2 grid of burners to the 2x2 grid of controls. And you know that just from your lived experience, you have this expectation that if you turn the knob for the top left knob, that will turn on the top left burner. That's sort of what natural mapping gets to. An example of a bad natural mapping would be something like this. If you've ever had a car that doesn't have automatic locks, power locks, you have had to pull up or push down on the little peg to unlock or lock your door. And from that intuition, you have this expectation that your power lock will work the same way, that the button on top will unlock and the button on the bottom will lock. There's no reason it has to be like that. But when it's the opposite, as in this picture, that gets confusing and that throws people off, and that can lead to accidentally locking or unlocking your car when you're not meaning to. In the web, here's an example of what that might mean. That might mean a contact us form where the first name comes before the last name. That's typically how we structure our names when we introduce ourselves, first then last. But that's not necessarily how we structure the data when we're dealing with, for instance, a spreadsheet full of form responses. A lot of the time it makes sense to organize by last name first. But what I'm going to challenge you to do here is to make your life slightly less convenient by meaning when you create that spreadsheet, you have to shift a column over and then organize by the last name. Make your life slightly less convenient and make the lives of the people who come to your website slightly more convenient, because the more times your users have to think about what they're doing, the more times they have to figure out how do these controls work. They don't act the way I expect them to act. The more times they're going to make mistakes, the more times you're going to get bad data, and the more users you're going to discourage from continuing to use your website. And maybe the first and last name thing isn't such a big deal, but you might see that start to compound and have real negative effects. And just as an example of a digital mapping that is not a natural mapping, I'm not sure if messages from the help desk through ServiceNow still do this or if that's been fixed yet. But you might have received an email at some point that had something like this. Your help desk interaction finishes with problem solved, you're done, or problem not solved, don't worry. And the red, that beautiful NC State red that we use everywhere for problem solved, is really suggesting the wrong thing here. It's suggesting you need to stop. It's suggesting this is a problem. It's suggesting that some action is required by you, when in fact, what the text actually says is you're done, everything's fixed. And then this gray, this more subdued, easier to miss or easier to ignore situation when your problem is not solved, that's actually where the action is for if you need to actually do something. So this is a situation where we have a digital interaction that's not following a natural mapping and can lead to some confusion. We also have what are called affordances, which for the purposes of this, we define as possibilities which are perceived by users based on their goals, beliefs, and expectations. So natural mapping is using what your users already know about the world. Affordances is being aware of what your users expect out of your web pages. So your users expect to see a header and a footer at the top and at the bottom. They expect to see a navigation menu. They expect to see a search bar. In some cases, those things aren't strictly necessary. You can have a website that doesn't have a footer. But since your users expect that from your web pages, expect that from your website, it's a good thing to include. It's a good thing to take advantage of what those expectations are and put information in that space to provide your users this other place that they can look for information about your website. You also have constraints. Constraints are the limitations we must work with to complete our tasks. Here's an image that goes along with constraints. So constraints should be intentional. They should not be sort of uh, the result of not thinking through a process, as this image might be. Excuse me. Sorry. So your constraints should be intentional. Constraints can come in lots of different forms. Constraints are physical constraints, like what is actually just possible. Constraints might be technical constraints in the web. Um, they aren't necessarily a bad thing. They are the things that define our boundaries that we have to work within. So on the web, you might have a website. Here's the Division of Academic and Student Affairs. This is a website that our team has worked on. Um, Constraints in this case might be university brand requirements. Every website has to have that NC State University brand bar across the top. It might be requirements set by the client. I didn't work on the DASA project, but it's possible that DASA said we need to make sure we have our mission statement right here front and center. Constraints might be legal requirements, so making sure that you have your your copyright notice in the bottom or something like that. Constraints are the again, the boundaries that we sort of have to work within. So again, some sample constraints. There are industry imposed constraints like design standards, client imposed constraints, the things that they really want to have on the website, university imposed constraints. And then we get into some of the technical things like theme options and required fields. So the theme that you're working with might only allow for certain things. The form that you create, you might specify certain required fields so that your users work within those constraints. So they only give you so they're required to give you the information you need them to give you. Excuse me. I'm going through this a little bit quickly because we're running a little low on time. And I have some pinging from Jen to remind me of that. It's 3:28 right now. This workshop is supposed to go until 3:30. I'm probably going to keep talking until we're all wrapped up. We're probably only going to go maybe 5 minutes over, but please stay with me if you're interested in hearing more. If you need to move on, I totally understand. So, okay. So, usability, we have three sort of rules. Rules here are not hard and fast. They're more guidelines. I think when Jen created this slide, she just really wanted to go for the usability rules and then the dude underneath. So we have the 3-click rule, the 2-second rule, and the 7 ± 2 principle. So the 3-click rule is that new websites, your first interaction with the website, people are willing to give about 3 clicks to find something. And these, I guess maybe these need to be 3 meaningful clicks. So not all information needs to be within 3 clicks of the homepage, but after your first 3 clicks, your users should feel like they're getting somewhere. They are meaningful clicks. They're enough to sort of buy another couple of clicks, convince the user that this is something that's not a waste of my time. The 2-second rule is the approximate response time after a click that people are willing to wait. As we've gotten high-speed internet, especially on campus, we've gotten really impatient about waiting for the next thing to happen. If you have big images, then those might take some time to load. You don't want to make sure that you have essential information in an image that is taking time to load. You want to remember, again, that your website is a collection of text documents and that you have the essential text that is important to somebody as text in the web page, and then images are additional information that sort of enhance that text. And then the 7 ± 2 principle. This was alluded to with the navigation menu earlier on. 7 ± 2 things is about how much we can remember in our short-term memory. If you give somebody a list of a list of things to remember, more than that, people start to forget generally. Less than that is no big deal. So when you're structuring your content or you're creating interactions for your users, more than 7 or 8 or 9 options, more than that in terms of the choices you're offering, is going to potentially lead to some user frustration because they can't remember what it is that they're working through. So I feel like we sped through the usability section a little bit faster than I would like. So just so that you all know, this is the first time we've done the presentation this way. This is a recent rewrite for this presentation. You've been our guinea pigs for that. If you do have any feedback on what seems to be missing, or if your expectations weren't met, there's a link to a feedback survey in the Q&A document, and I really hope you fill it out. I would really appreciate any feedback you give. But before you go and fill out that form, let's do a quick recap of sort of the essential things that I hope you walk away from today from this presentation. The first thing, I think I've said this like 17 times, is that your website is just a collection of text documents. Clearly, it's a lot more than that to you, to the organization that your website represents. But this is a good thing to remember when you're organizing and designing your content. It's a good mindset to be in, that it has to be text first. You have to focus on what that text says, focus on how it's structured. The second thing that I hope you remember is that content matters. That the first obligation of owning a website is keeping it accurate, up to date, and well organized. And that's how you should start thinking about problems before you start thinking about what it looks like. Third, I hope you all find a designated dissenter. It's always, always, always helpful to have somebody who can tell you, no, your idea is a bad idea. This isn't going to work. Fourth, accessibility helps everybody. So again, make sure your information is available as text, and then think about those mismatched interactions. Think about a situation where somebody might not be able to do something because you are expecting them to interact with your website in one way, but maybe they're not able to. You're expecting them to be able to see something. Not everybody can see it. And then finally, build on what your users already know. So your users coming in know a lot. They have a certain set of expectations, and you can take advantage of that. You can make a usable and effective website by sort of playing to the strengths that your users already have, rather than trying to make them rethink how everything should work. So with that, I'm going to leave you with a few resources. Link to the slides here, go.nccu.edu/intermediate-wp-content-mgmt. That link I'll also share in an email out to the class. Everybody who attended, probably either later today or tomorrow morning, along with a link to the YouTube video if you want to rewatch all of my coughing, and then some other information as well. Linked in these slides, so when you get the link to the slides, you can skip to this slide and then click on these links. We have a content recommendations page on the website getontheweb.ncsu.edu. There's a lot of good information there, some of which is shared in this presentation, some of which is not. It also includes a helpful checklist for evaluating content, making sure that it's ready to go or if it needs revision. I do encourage you, again, if you're building anything for the university, to look at the university brand guidelines. And then if you're using WordPress on campus, our team holds office hours, open office hours, no reservation or no need to request anything from us. You can just drop in anytime, every Friday from 9 a.m. to noon in Avent Ferry Technology Center, room 106, which is downstairs in the basement. If you don't know where AFTC is, it's right on Avent Ferry, across the street from Mission Valley, next to the big student housing building. And if you just search for Avent Ferry Technology Center, it should come up in Google Maps. So with all of that said, Thank you for listening. Thank you for interacting in the Q&A document. Uh, Thank you for being patient as I cough and cough and cough and cough. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. I should include this on the slide. Our team's email address is oitdesign, all one word, oitdesign @ncsu.edu. And again, I'll be emailing everybody who signed up for the workshop with these resources. But otherwise, thank you very much. And we'll see you again some other time.